In my most recent episode, I posed the question of what Final Fantasy fans would most like to see from a hypothetical Final Fantasy XVII. Of the 200 plus comments on that episode, at least 70% to date have suggested a return to turn-based combat, and a good 80% have called for a return to a Fellowship party-based questline. Indeed, while it has long been called for from some sections of the fanbase, and seemingly increasingly remote from Square Enix's action RPG trajectory, the imminent release of Expedition 33 by Sandfall Interactive could perhaps shift the dial on modern perceptions of turn-based games and their viability in today's market. But what is it that makes Expedition 33 so interesting to Final Fantasy fans? It would be remiss to say that turn-based Fellowship titles have died off entirely, and quite to the contrary, titles such as Dragon Quest, Persona, and Fantasian show that they are still being made, that there is still a market for them, and profit to be made from them. But at the same time, to call these titles mainstream or blockbuster sort of titles that generate mass appeal would also be somewhat disingenuous. They are firmly within the niche of Japanese games and Japanese game players, and have never really broken out of that particular mould to generate the mass appeal of, say, a Final Fantasy game since the latter 1990s. What makes Clair Obscur so interesting, I think, is how it has, at first glance at least, adopted these core principles of JRPG design, the Fellowship adventure, the turn-based mechanics, a world map, so on, and built up around them with gameplay and flashiness of a AAA title, and the previews so far have shown us lush open environments, a voice cast that includes Charlie Cox, Andy Serkis, and Final Fantasy darling Ben Starr, to name but a few, and generally has the scope associated with bigger action adventures or Western RPGs. This is interesting in no small part because Sandfall Interactive is a Western studio based in France, who's vocally taken inspiration from the turn-based heyday of Final Fantasy, while on the flip side, for Square Enix's part, they've spent the last decade or so moving away from the roots of JRPG game design, taking Final Fantasy in an overtly action-based, quote marks, Western RPG sort of direction. So we are at a curious intersection here. Is Expedition 33 the opening volley of a turn-based RPG renaissance that's emerging out of Western studios rather than Japanese, addressing, as Sandfall's creator Guillaume Broche asserts, that there is a deficit in high-fidelity turn-based games in recent years? And if indeed Clair Obscur releases to any sort of acclaim, as many Final Fantasy fans and JRPG fans seem to be hoping, will this mean that Japanese studios, and specifically studios like Square Enix, be attentive to and responsive to this apparent viability and renaissance of turn-based Fellowship quests in the modern era? It's an interesting possibility, and not entirely implausible, since the overlap of personalities and personnel like Ben Starr, who is very visible in both the Final Fantasy Square Enix community, is of course associated with Expedition 33 and sure to do his part to boost its visibility. So almost certainly this game is going to end up on Square's radar, if not already. For my part, I very rarely pre-order games, but I have taken a punt on Expedition 33 out of pure curiosity more than anything. I'm very keen to see how they reconcile turn-based gameplay with what looks like some aspects of real-time QTE, real-time traversability, that sort of thing. And I'm keen to see how a Western studio interprets and implements these turn-based, overtly kind of Japanese traditions and game design approaches. And while I've read that much of the team are comprised of Ubisoft alumni, having skimmed through their team bio on the Sandfall website, I was quite heartened to see their favourite games listed. Final Fantasy VIII was up there, among at least two of the staff. Metal Gear Solid was up there, Elden Ring, Resident Evil, all of these classic Japanese titles and Japanese institutions, which we might assume inspired the product they are imminently releasing. And it's funny actually, since just last week in my previous episode I suggested that emerging Square Enix directors might be those who grew up inspired by Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX. And we are in fact perhaps seeing this, but just from a completely different studio on the other side of the world. Additionally, I don't often get wooed in by actors and big names, but as a debuting title and a debuting game studio, the calibre of the voice cast certainly lends it a sort of a certain credibility. The art direction, soundtrack, dark fantasy genre looks great to me, and while I haven't delved deep into the preview articles and the preview footage too much, because I do like to surprise myself with new experiences firsthand, some of the top level summaries have described this game as having a class-based party, an overworld map, and a semi-linear story in the same vein, I suppose, as Final Fantasy X, where there are some free-roaming branches, but story takes precedence over explorability, which suits me down to the ground. Finally, a lot of retailers are stocking pre-orders of this game between 10 and 20% discount, which also suits me. And actually, it makes me laugh a bit because a few articles have been responding to this with gamer concerns that the game is retailing quite cheaply. So I do wonder whether it's the same people complaining that some games are $100+ at release these days. But regardless, Sandfall have responded to this saying that they're trying to encourage a broad uptake in this game at release. And at 20% off, I was pretty sold on it, and I really want to see how this sort of Western JRPG plays out. So that's my top level take on the upcoming Clair Obscur, which has been bubbling up in conversation and increasingly talked about among Final Fantasy fans, Final Fantasy communities, who hope, in a roundabout way, any potential success of this game will move the dial at Square Enix and their approach to how they are making games. I'm not affiliated with or promoting this game, obviously, but I'm very conscious not everyone's heard of it yet, and I think some of the people that are familiar with my channel might be interested in it, as you know, there is a tendency to be more into the Final Fantasy games from 6 through 10, and I think this game seems to fit the mould for a lot of those sorts. So maybe check out a trailer, see if it's up your street. And yeah, I'll be very interested to see how it turns out, whether it can change the debate around turn-based games being antiquated and that sort of thing. And ultimately, can a Western game studio turn out a modern turn-based JRPG that is more Final Fantasy than the current state of Final Fantasy? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.